Hi, I'm Russell Sturgis. I'm the founder and principal of EAP mentor. Welcome to the fourth in a series of 5 blogs that I'm presenting on the 5 principles of the Enhancers Awareness Program. This week I'm looking at the 4th principle, which is when something is observed, it changes. In the written blog that goes with today's video, I've explored this whole idea of the difference between observation and perception. And I'm sort of proposing the idea that observation is more factual. In other words, it's the ability to be able to use our senses to see what's there in a factual way without actually giving anything a meaning. As opposed to perception, which is where we add a filter and then have what it is that we're observing through our senses mean something based on previous programming or conditioning that has us see things in a specific way. And so what this particular principle suggests is that when we're able to step away from perception, we're able to change what reality looks like, given that perception distorts it to look the way that we want it to look, based on, as I said, based on our programming or our experience that has us believe that things look a certain way. A really simple example of this is if in the course of your experience you've been bitten by a dog in your childhood and that hasn't been resolved, what happens is you go through your life with the perception that dogs can bite, and therefore every time you see a dog, fear, fright, flight or fight, and all of the responses that are about survival or avoiding pain come to the fore, and you might feel your heart starting to beat a little faster because adrenaline's been released. You might feel yourself starting to sweat a little bit, and because these are all of the mechanisms that the body uses to get you to prepare with to deal with an adversary, as opposed to somebody who could turn up just purely in the place of observation, who sees a dog and recognises that it's a dog without giving the dog any meaning. So in other words, they don't have a vested perception in terms of whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, and there's essentially no story. And of course, in that particular case, none of the fight or flight mechanisms come into place. Somebody can see a dog in that perspective and all of a sudden there's no sweating, there's no increased heartbeat, there's no fear being experienced, and the experience of being with the dog is completely different. So when something's observed as opposed to being perceived, it changes. So in other words, we're able to change the reality through observation to what it is that we're experiencing through perception. So this is a really significant principle, because what it means is that we change our reality, for example, around dogs, by changing how we perceive the dog, not by changing the dog. So tying the dog up, or getting rid of the dog, or replacing the dog with a cat, or doing any other thing to manipulate the external, sure, it's going to save you from having to experience your fear in that moment. But the fact is that that filter that distorts your perception is going to always be there. And so the consequence of that is that you could run into a dog where you can't tie it up, where you can't get it out of sight, where you can't replace it with a cat. In other words, all of the management mechanisms that you might be able to apply to protect you so you don't have to engage your fright, flight or fight can't be managed in every situation, which means that you're going to experience those at some stage or other when you come across circumstances that you can't manage. And it's kind of funny how invariably the thing that we fear comes upon us, and it's amazing how many times people who are afraid of dogs constantly are being exposed to dogs and being exposed to their fear. Now, what this principle says is that when you have the capacity just to be the observer, which means that you're no longer applying any filters to what's going on, then you're able to change what's actually happening in the experience, in terms of your experience and how you're relating to what's happening. So this is going to happen in relationships. This is going to happen in endeavours, the things that you do. This is going to happen with your thoughts and your perceptions, so that every aspect of how you play out your life physically, mentally, emotionally and spiritually has all of these perceptions associated with it that force life to turn up in a certain way. The interesting thing about these perceptions that is invariably for many of us, life can only turn up in the way that we perceive. So in other words, and I talked about this in the last video, is that we're only going to see what we have a filter for. And it isn't until that filter has been changed that we have the ability to be able to change what it is that we can see in the world. And so one of the things that's really important, for example, if we use the situation around being afraid of dogs, is that as a result of what went on at some stage in your formative years, you developed a belief system that dogs were something to be afraid of. And so you have a story around dogs that then dictates how you experience dogs now as an adult. That's exactly the same for just about every other aspect of our life, and more particularly when it comes to our perception of ourselves. So I want you to just extrapolate this for a minute to the idea or notion that what if you have a belief about your worth that you established in your childhood, and that worth is now the filter or the perception that you bring into your life as an adult. And in exactly the same way that your fear of dog distorts your reality, your story about your self-worth does exactly the same thing. Is that you then begin, if your story's about being not smart enough, you then begin to see a reality that reinforces the fact that you're not smart enough. The fact that maybe you're an outsider, and you've got this belief that you don't fit in, and all of a sudden you have this filter that sees opportunities to reinforce this idea that I don't fit in. And so what we have is a much more complex fear of dogs, and this is fear of our self-worth or lack of worth, that then plays out in our experience of life and becomes the filter that regulates and impacts on what it is that we experience in our life experience. So this fourth principle, which goes on the back of healing is listening and you can't change what you can't see, this fourth principle really addresses this whole idea that if you really understand the power of becoming the observer without the filter, then you understand how to change reality. And that, in fact, any effort to try and change reality outside of you is limited, because you don't always get to control the external variables. The beauty of this particular approach is that you do control the internal variables, albeit that it's not always easy, but that you have the ability to shift perception so that you become more the witness and less of that which is the judge or the filter that executes your belief and projects it onto what's happening. Now, the whole key to what we do at EAP is that we say the ability to become the witness or the observer is achieved through becoming more mindful. And we would have said this all the way along, and I'm going to reiterate it here. Mindfulness is coming to that place where you remember that you have a choice. So if we talk in neurological terms, when you created your fear of dogs, you created a neural pathway that says, when I see an animal that looks like this, then I need to respond fearfully or in the way that I do. And so you have an automatic habitual neural pathway that's been established over years that functions in this response, doing what you've always done, getting what you've always got. Mindfulness is developing enough awareness, and of course, as we say, awareness is about gathering knowledge and understanding, where you gather knowledge and understanding sufficiently to appreciate that it doesn't have to be a fearful experience. There's lots of people who just have really loving and nurturing and profound experiences with dogs. And so it's about being able to explore what that looks like and to understand how it's possible to develop that. And then maintain the mindfulness that is to entertain this alternative reality whenever you're presented with confronting a dog. So that in that moment, instead of just going into automatic pilot, into habitual mode, you stop and you take a moment and you feel what it is that you're feeling, and then you go, hang on a second, I have also done research that says to me that it could be different. And you take a moment to observe those two options. And it's not about them both, one of them being right or wrong. It is about them being more or less serving, but not about being right or wrong. And you hold that awareness. And of course, in the process that we take in EAP, we then say, then do what is the easiest option in that moment. And if the neural pathway for going down the more loving relationship with dogs hasn't been established, and you have to use will and determination to force yourself to go down that isn't serving. And so if the fear's still there, then do what you need to do to be able to honour what your reality is while you're still being governed by that particular neural pathway. But the key here is to, every time when you're presented with the experience of confronting a dog, stopping and taking the time to consider this new awareness that you have, that you can hold about them in the context of your story and how you've always related to them. Each time you stop and reinforce that new alternative reality, which is certainly a more loving one and one that's less stressful, every time you stop and consider that, you're helping to reprogram that neural pathway. And it may be that you've got some friends with dogs that you know are friendly, and you might expose yourself to them and have an opportunity to be playful and to do things with them. Each time you get to do that, you're reinforcing the new neural pathway. Now, what happens is, as you're able to bring that place of being the witness, the observer, which is really what mindfulness is being about, there's a tipping point. There's a natural tipping point where you actually find yourself not responding out of fear, and you notice that you encounter a dog and you don't feel the adrenals, you don't feel your heart racing, you don't feel yourself sweating, and you find yourself actually being in a position where you actually feel quite safe. And it may be that in that moment you have an encounter or an experience with a dog that completely defies anything that's been the reality in the past. And so here's where this fourth principle really sticks, and that is when something's observed, it changes. So that by coming to the place of being the witness without the story, without the narrative, and truly being the observer, it provides an opportunity for reality to be different. Now, I've talked about dogs. This same principle applies to spouses, to bosses, to colleagues, to friends, you name it, and more particularly to the belief that we have about our own worth. I hope that you find this of interest and informative, and that you could give some thought to this whole notion that when something is observed, that it can change, that what you experience and how you relate to life can be different. Anyway, if you want to know more about what we do at EAP, go to our website, eapmentor.com, and we have a great Facebook page, Enhances Awareness Program, which just about every day has something on how to live life more mindfully. Thank you for listening, and in the next in our five series on the principles of EAP, we're talking about how consciousness is like ripples in a pond, and how shifting one aspect of consciousness has the ability to impact on all of it. Anyway, until then, enjoy the written blog with the video, and I'll tell you more about our principles next time. Bye.